This is the Ramana Maharshi satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and deeply meditate. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. Welcome, I'm Richard Clarke. I'm not a guru or a teacher. I just love this teaching, and so I want to share it. I'm reviewing and commenting on the book Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. This week is from Talk 174. Dr. Hand, the American gentleman, asked, "Are there two methods for finding out the source of the ego?" Maharshi, there are no two sources and no two methods. There is only one source and only one method. Dr. Han asked, what is the difference between meditation and inquiry into the self? Maharshi, meditation is possible only if the ego be kept up. There is the ego and the object meditated upon. The method is indirect, whereas the self is only one. Seeking the ego, that is its source, ego disappears. What is left over is the self. This method is the direct one. Dr. Hand, then what am I to do? Maharshi, to hold on to the self. Dr. Hand, how? Maharshi, even now you are the self, but you are confounding this consciousness or ego with the absolute consciousness. This false identification is due to ignorance. Ignorance disappears along with the ego. Killing the ego is the only thing to accomplish. Realization is already there. No attempt is needed to attain realization, for it is nothing external, nothing new. It is always and everywhere, here and now, too. In this dialogue between Ramana Maharshi and Dr. Hand seeks clarity on the methods of finding the source of the ego and asks, are there two ways to find the self? Ramana says that there are not two sources or methods or two things to find. There is only one source and one method, emphasizing the singularity of the path to self-realization. Ramana says that meditation involves an ego that meditates on an object, which is indirect knowledge. Direct knowledge is the experiential realization of the self found through internal investigation and self-inquiry, while indirect knowledge is based on external sources and conceptual understanding. Self-inquiry is direct. It seeks the source of the ego itself. This seeking leads to the dissolution of the imaginary ego and the realization of the self. Ramana asks you to recognize that you are already the self. The key is to differentiate the ego or limited consciousness from the absolute consciousness, which is the self, the always changing world of mind and ego from the unchanging absolute consciousness. This can be achieved by inquiring into the source of the ego. According to Ramana, killing the ego is accomplished through self-inquiry. By seeking the source of the ego dissolves as you discover that it was never real to begin with, and what remains is the self. Ignorance is the root cause of this false identification. By recognizing this ignorance and inquiring into the source of the ego, you dispel the illusion. Ramana makes it clear that realization is not something external or new. It is always and everywhere. It is here and now. It is not an external achievement, but the recognition of the inherent self. Self-inquiry involves turning your attention inward and asking, who am I? Where does this sense of I come from? By tracing the ego back to its source, you can experience the direct realization of the self. This dialogue reinforces the core principle of Ramana Maharshi's teachings, the direct path to self-realization through self-inquiry. It emphasizes the simplicity of recognizing that you are already the self, and the ego is an illusion born of ignorance. By inquiring into the ego's source, you can dissolve the ego with the knowledge that it never was real and uncover the eternal truth of the self, yourself, the only self that there is. It is always present, always real, and requires no external attainment. This is self-realization. Self-inquiry can serve as a guide to deepen your understanding and experience of this profound teaching. So, inquire, know yourself, and be always free and at peace. And now a talk from Nome, Tat Tvam Asi.
In the Vedas, specifically the Chandogya Upanishad, the instruction is given Tat Tvam Asi, that you are. That is Brahman, that is the real self. And the instruction is, that is what you are. Similarly, we find elsewhere in the Upanishads, I am Atma Brahma. This self is Brahman. And also, Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman. There are similar statements in the Vedas and elsewhere, expressive of the truth of what we really are. The highest, being, consciousness, bliss, is our own nature. To realize it conclusively, one has only to be rid of misidentification, the attachment of oneself to something that is not the self. In its crudest form, such delusion manifests as attaching one's innate happiness to some object, thinking that the happiness is dependent on the object, and if the object goes elsewhere, our happiness has gone elsewhere. One of those objects is the body. But if we confound ourselves and mix up our identity, thinking our being is the body, and our happiness is dependent on the state of the body, then we will suffer, needlessly, but we will suffer. The suffering being merely an absence, or a veiling, rather, of the happiness. Similar is it with the misidentification with what one thinks. If you consider yourself to be what you think, then your state changes as your thinking changes. If you are the mind or are in the mind, the immaculate, innate freedom of the infinite consciousness, which is our real nature, you are that, is veiled. The truth, the happiness, the consciousness, do not go elsewhere, no more than you ever cease to exist. But ignorance acts like a veil. It is merely a case of imagination. If that imagination can be put an end to, by any means, that which is innate, our own true self, shines. Well, again, it's always shining, it's always existing. Just as you always exist, and you always know you exist. And the fact that you are, and the knowledge that you are inseparable. Never is there a time when you are not. And never is there a time when you lose the knowledge that you are. But whatever has through imagination been added onto that, so that seemingly what you are and the knowledge that you are is dependent on some other thing, the thing that's been added on, to that degree, ignorance fails. What is to be done? Inquire deeply. Inquire deeply and abandon the wrong association of yourself within the object. Anything objective, from a subtle thought to the form of your own body. If we pursue such inquiry, who am I? The ideas of I and my connected with other things, something imagined to be broken off in the midst of vast, limitless being, which is what we really are. Such imagination ceases. Even the idea, expediently used for purposes of spiritual instruction, that one is in ignorance and later one is out of ignorance, is not entirely true. Who are you? Who are you always? That which is called Brahman, the vast absolute, that which is called the self, the only self that you really are, that which is called God, beyond which there is nothing else. That is our very existence. Treat it as something else, as something distant from you, or as a particular state of mind, and it will seem to be elsewhere, or that it will seem to come and go. Set aside the objective outlook. Make your inquiry non-objective. Detach yourself from false transitory appearances. and know yourself as you really are. Then you find the indestructibility of the knowledge of truth is just the fact of your very being.
Excuse me. Now, let's take a few minutes and inquire. Notice that you exist, and you know that you exist. Inquire, investigate within yourself. Can I find this source of the ego within myself? If the ego is just imagined, what is the source of the imagination? Is the ego real? How do I distinguish between the ego and the self? What is the role of ignorance in the confusion between the ego and the self? How can I practically work on killing the ego? Are there specific thoughts or patterns I need to let go of to move closer to realization? Who am I? What is the source of this sense of I? What is the nature of my existence? All right. And let's close with a chant. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace.
Wow. Mm.
Now, I really appreciated Ramana's talking about what is the difference between meditation and inquiry, because those are both things that I do regularly. And I get it when he says basically meditation is still for the mind.
Yeah, it's like meditating on an object.
Yes.
If you're doing Atmavachar, you're turning in and just attending to the self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Awesome teaching. Subtle, simple,
Yes.
awesome teaching. So full of grace.
Yes. And, you know, I was thinking that as you were talking about it, what wonderful grace has filled our heart.
Yeah. And there's no difference between our heart and grace, I think.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Well, also, I think Ramana says basically that, grace is not from something else. Grace is already who we are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And what a wonderful talk from Nome. And to have those YouTubes that you bring to us with Nome
Uh-huh.
being our Ramana today.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. It seems like he's the best guide to Ramana that I've found,
Yeah.
other than what the guide that we can find if we look within and actually get our minds quiet.
Mhm. Mhm.
Again, that's one of the things that I love about the teaching is that it's not something else that we're looking for. It's not something that we have to attain or transform into. It is what we always have been.
Here and now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so the problem is just to get the mind and the ego to be quiet so you can have the here and now without interference. Anyway, namaste. Thank you for
Thank you,
coming
Richard.
together today, and we'll see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
These videos help bring Ramana Maharshi's teachings into your direct experience. Subscribe now